the women who disappeared from the witch trials. Hey everyone, tonight we are drifting back to a quieter corner of history, the kind that hums softly in the background. Not the grand stories of kings and conquests, but the murmured tales of people who simply vanished. So, if you're tucked in and ready to drift off, let's lower the lanterns a little, breathe out, settle the blankets, and let's go back to the 1600s, to a Europe that smelled faintly of wood smoke, candle wax, and fear, because tonight we're talking about the women who didn't burn. Now, everyone knows the stories of witch trials, the frantic hysteria, the finger pointing, the screaming in the square, thousands of women accused, tortured, and burned in the name of divine order. But scattered between those bonfires, there were survivors, women who confessed to witchcraft, and yet, somehow, were not executed. They simply faded back into the countryside, sometimes branded, sometimes shunned, sometimes quietly kept by the very institutions that condemned them. It's a strange, uneasy story, the half-life of witchcraft in the shadows of power. Let's start in the Holy Roman Empire, that wonderful administrative tangle that covered most of Central Europe. By the late 16th century, the witch hunts were practically a cottage industry. In some towns, officials were reimbursed per confession, which made mercy economically inconvenient. But even there, records mention certain women who were spared. They were usually older midwives, herbalists, or the local wise women. They had what the courts called useful knowledge. And so, after their confessions, they were sometimes quietly retained. The phrasing is always vague. Retained, not freed, not acquitted, just kept. Imagine confessing to the devil, expecting fire, and instead being told to report weekly to a local magistrate to help identify other witches. In effect, some of these women became the state's own informants, the first bureaucratic witches. Naturally, this led to chaos. An accused which would name others to save herself. Then those others would be spared to name still more, like a dreadful pyramid scheme, but with more torches. One of the earliest surviving examples comes from Würzburg, around 1628. A woman named Anna Golden was accused of bewitching a child. Her trial was long, confused, and steeped in rumor, and then she wasn't executed. The official record says her confession was incomplete. Incomplete, a word that covered a multitude of political sins. Some historians think she was quietly hired by a local noble family who valued her medical knowledge. Others believe she became a sort of unofficial exorcist, a woman tainted enough to fight darkness with darkness. Whatever the truth, she disappears from the archive soon after. No burial record, no death notice, just gone, which, in early modern Europe, was almost miraculous. Let's drift across the sea for a moment, to Scotland, where witch trials were brisk. The Scots were thorough, practical, and blessed with terrible weather, which made them excellent prosecutors of imaginary crimes. But even there, a few women slipped through the net. Take Isabel Gowdy from Aldern. In 1662, she gave one of the most detailed confessions in European history. She described shapes shifting into a hare. She talked about dancing with the Queen of Elfame, the Fairy Queen, in glowing caverns beneath the earth. It was, frankly, some of the best fantasy writing of the 17th century, and yet, there's no record of her execution. The papers just stopped. It's as if the Scottish courts took one look at her vivid imagination and thought, well, perhaps the devil's got enough paperwork already. Some folklorists think Isabel was absorbed into local legend, half real, half myth. Children were told not to wander near the moors, or Isabel Gowdy would turn them into crows. And somewhere in that myth, the real woman, who once confessed to impossible things, kept living. There's a pattern in these disappearances. Women who survived witch trials tended to have something useful about them, a talent, a skill, a social connection that made killing them awkward. Take the midwives. Every village needed one, even if the priest muttered about unholy herbs. If a midwife was accused of witchcraft, her execution could mean no baby survived the winter. So sometimes, the community just pretended not to notice. She'd still live under suspicion. No one would lend her salt or bread, but when the time came, they'd still knock on her door, trembling when the birth pains started, and she'd still come. Because for all the sermons about evil, people still preferred a live witch to a dead mother. One curious case comes from Bamberg in 1631, a time when witch hunting there was practically industrial. Over 900 people executed in less than 5 years. But among the lists of the condemned, there's one woman whose name appears twice. First, marked as condemned. Then, a few months later, marked as appointed servant to the bishop's household. It seems the bishop's own staff were superstitious. They wanted a repentant witch nearby to keep evil spirits away. So, this woman, whose friends had all burned, found herself polishing silverware in a palace that smelled of incense and fear. There's no sign of what happened to her later, but I like to imagine her moving silently through those marble halls, serving wine to the same men who'd sentenced her, and thinking, very quietly, that perhaps the devil had chosen the wrong people. Of course, not every spared woman was lucky. Some were imprisoned indefinitely, in what records call pious confinement. That's an elegant way of saying locked in a cell until someone remembered to stop feeding her. Monasteries, particularly in southern Germany and Italy, occasionally took in repentant witches. The idea was that isolation and prayer would purge their sin. In practice, it was just convenient storage, a living warning to others. There's a diary from a Benedictine abbess in 1680 that mentions 3 of the fallen women. She writes, "They sit quiet now. They spin flax and say little. No names, no ages, just 3 shadows spinning until the ink runs out." Now, the church loved a good object lesson, and a living witch, humbled, veiled, and silent, was more persuasive than ashes. Some of these women were made to walk in processions, carrying candles or crosses, while the townspeople watched, a display of repentance. It was, in its way, theater, medieval public relations. The message was clear. Sin can be contained. Fear can be harnessed. Even the devil's brides can be domesticated with enough incense. There's another layer to this. Politics. Witchcraft accusations were often tangled in local rivalries. A noblewoman's servant, for instance, might be accused by a rival household. If the accused had powerful patrons, she might not burn. She might simply be reassigned, banished to a convent, or quietly relocated to another estate. In England, where trials were fewer but no less absurd, there are several such cases. Women who confessed, but were later recorded as housekeepers or healers under noble families. It's as if the rich simply repurposed them, sin recycled as service, because really, why waste a good witch when you can have her bless your garden? By the 18th century, the witch craze was fading. Science had begun its slow crawl into daylight, and the church had other things to worry about, like Enlightenment philosophers being smug in coffee houses. But the habit of blaming inconvenient women didn't vanish. It just rebranded. Witches became hysterics. Demons became melancholia. And instead of fire, the new punishment was confinement in asylums. The pattern stayed eerily similar. Women who spoke too freely, healed too cleverly, or lived too independently, all carefully contained. One could almost admire the consistency. If we step back from the trials and look at the broader picture, something else becomes clear. Witch hunts were never really about witches. They were about control, about defining who was inside the circle and who wasn't. The women who burned were those who resisted definition. Too loud, too clever, too poor, too old. And the ones who didn't burn, the ones who disappeared, were those who managed somehow to make themselves useful again, to reshape their image into something the community could tolerate. It's a grim sort of survival, but survival all the same. Sometimes, I imagine one of those spared women, perhaps in her 50s, gray-haired, hands scarred from years of grinding herbs, living quietly on the edge of a village. She knows what people whisper. She keeps her head down. Children dare each other to run past her cottage, but every so often, a desperate mother knocks at her door, and she opens it. Still, because even after everything, after torture, humiliation, and the long shadow of the stake, she still knows how to bring life into the world. And perhaps that's her small revenge. By the time Enlightenment thinkers finally declared witchcraft a superstition, many of these women were long gone. Their names survive only in half-legible court notes, or in the margins of parish ledgers, somewhere between crime and miracle, between human and myth. The women who disappeared didn't truly vanish. They just slipped sideways into folklore. You can still find them, faintly, in the stories of the wise woman or the herb mother, figures both feared and respected, echoes of real people who endured the impossible and outlasted it by becoming something half-remembered. And that, in its quiet way, might be the most magical thing of all. Let's drift a little deeper now. In the next part, we'll follow another strange undercurrent in history, one that winds through royal bedrooms and family portraits that look a little too identical. Because up next, we'll be meeting the most inbred monarchs in European history. So for now, breathe slow, close your eyes if you like, and let the last embers of the witch fires fade into the dark. And I'll see you in part 2. The most inbred monarchs in European history. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived the witch trials, and if you drifted off somewhere around repentant midwife, that's fine too. Tonight we're floating gently into the softer, stranger tragedy of royal bloodlines, the great European hobby of marrying your cousin, because for several centuries, royal families believed that the best way to preserve purity was to keep their gene pool so small it could fit in a thimble. And of course, they were very proud of that. Let's start with the family that made inbreeding into a political art form, the Habsburgs. If Europe had a family tree, the Habsburgs would be the branch that kept looping back into itself, a genetic Ouroboros, swallowing its own tail. At their height, they ruled much of Europe, Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, the Low Countries, all technically run by people who shared the same great-grandparents, sometimes twice. They had a motto: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did, repeatedly, to one another. It started reasonably enough in the late Middle Ages, when intermarriage helped cement alliances. But over time, alliance became code for The same 10 people, over and over, until someone's jaw stops working properly. Because, yes, that actually happened. Let's meet the most famous casualty of Habsburg genetics, Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, Charles was technically a king, but biologically speaking, he was more of an experiment. His parents were uncle and niece. Their parents had also been uncle and niece. By the time Charles arrived, the family tree wasn't a tree anymore. It was a wreath, and his body kept the receipts. Charles had the legendary Habsburg jaw, that long, jutting chin you see in portraits. Contemporaries said he couldn't properly close his mouth or chew solid food. He spoke with difficulty, drooled often, and suffered from chronic illness. But somehow, that wasn't even the worst of it. He was also infertile, epileptic, and mentally delayed. Not cruelly so, but enough to make governance impossible. He spent his reign surrounded by priests, doctors, and astrologers, all trying to cure him through every method imaginable: leeching, bleeding, holy water, exorcism, and on one memorable occasion, powdered human skull, because naturally, they made it worse. Charles' advisors ran Spain in his name badly. Wars were lost, debts piled up, and food shortages spread. Meanwhile, Charles collected holy relics and prayed for a miracle. When he finally died in 1700 at the age of 38, his autopsy reportedly found that his body was without a single drop of blood, which feels metaphorically on brand. He left no heir, no surprise there, and his death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that killed hundreds of thousands of people because one family had refused to marry outside its own cousins for 200 years. It's a grimly impressive legacy. Let's drift northward to Austria now, where the other branch of the Habsburgs was doing exactly the same thing, just with slightly better lighting. In the 18th century, Maria Theresa of Austria was a powerhouse monarch, intelligent, pragmatic, and devoted to family. So devoted, in fact, that she arranged marriages between her children and their cousins across Europe, ensuring that almost every throne had a Habsburg niece perched on it somewhere. Her daughter Marie Antoinette, for example, married into the French Bourbons, another family equally allergic to genetic diversity. Marie was charming and lively, but she came from a long line of people who all looked faintly similar and occasionally fainted during dinner. So when the French Revolution arrived and the monarchy lost its head, literally, some might say the Habsburgs' policy of keeping it in the family finally reached its logical conclusion. But perhaps you're thinking, surely this was just a Habsburg problem. Oh no, the inbreeding bug was contagious. Let's drift over to Britain, where royal matchmaking was treated like strategic chess played by extremely anxious grandmothers. The House of Hanover, which later became the Windsors, wasn't exactly immune. They tended to marry within German princely families, most of whom were already related. By the 19th century, Queen Victoria took it to new heights or depths, depending on your perspective. She and her husband, Prince Albert, were first cousins. They adored each other. To be fair, romantically and genetically. Together, they had 9 children, and then married most of them off to other European royals. Victoria was proud of this network. She called herself the grandmother of Europe, which was true, disturbingly so. By 1914, her grandchildren sat on the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Norway, and Spain. So when World War I began, it was essentially a family argument with artillery. The more unfortunate side effect of all this royal matchmaking was the spread of hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder that prevents clotting. It appeared in Queen Victoria's lineage and spread like polite gossip across the continent. Her son Leopold suffered from it. Her grandsons in Spain and Germany carried it. And her great-grandson, Alexei Romanov of Russia, inherited it too. If that name sounds familiar, yes, he was the son of Tsar Nicholas II. The boy mystic Rasputin was supposedly healing. Alexei's hemophilia was severe. A small bruise could be life-threatening. The imperial family hid his condition, but it dictated nearly every decision they made. Rasputin's influence over the empress came from his ability, real or imagined, to ease the boy's bleeding episodes. So, in an ironic twist of genealogy, Queen Victoria's affection for her cousin husband indirectly helped topple the Russian Empire. Family dinners must have been awkward. Now, the Bourbons, France's illustrious dynasty, deserve an honorable mention in the Hall of Genetic Fame. By the 17th century, their family portraits had reached a point of alarming uniformity. Long noses, downturned mouths, and an air of melancholy that suggested everyone had just realized they'd married their cousin again. One particularly unlucky Bourbon was Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon to rule after the Habsburgs fizzled out. He was technically a fresh start, French blood, new dynasty, new hope. Unfortunately, Philip was also chronically depressed, prone to obsessive rituals, and once refused to change his clothes for months because he believed doing so might cause his death. He spent long stretches muttering prayers and trembling in darkened rooms, while his wife, another Bourbon, naturally, tried to keep the kingdom functioning. Medical historians now suspect bipolar disorder or severe depression, but at the time, it was chalked up to melancholy, a fashionable diagnosis for nobles who had inherited too many of the same ancestors. If we step back for a moment, what's astonishing isn't just the genetic collapse. It's that everyone involved knew it was happening and carried on anyway. Royal blood was considered sacred, untouchable, almost divine. The idea of marrying a commoner, meaning someone not related to you, was viewed as borderline blasphemous. They would rather risk congenital deformity than social contamination. It's one of history's strangest contradictions. People who believed themselves chosen by God, slowly dismantling their own lineage in pursuit of purity. And yet, amid the deformities and dynastic disasters, there were brief flashes of self-awareness. In the late 18th century, Emperor Joseph II, another Habsburg, of course, tried to reform marriage customs. He encouraged nobles to seek partners based on temperament and virtue instead of bloodlines. It was a radical idea. Naturally, no one listened. Within a generation, the same families were marrying the same cousins again. Old habits die hard, especially when they come with castles. By the 19th century, advances in medicine and biology began exposing the consequences of inbreeding more clearly. Doctors noticed hereditary patterns, epilepsy, infertility, mental illness, all politely noted in royal health reports that were never published. Still, change came slowly. It wasn't until the 20th century, after 2 world wars had wiped out several monarchies, that the surviving royals began marrying outsiders again. Today, the Windsors, for instance, are practically genetic revolutionaries by comparison. When Prince William married Catherine Middleton, a commoner with a university degree and working parents, some commentators called it a modern fairy tale, but really, it was biology breathing a sigh of relief. It's tempting to laugh at the absurdity, at centuries of crowned cousins producing heirs who could barely chew or walk straight. But it's also oddly human. These monarchs weren't evil geniuses plotting their decline. They were trapped inside a system that worshipped its own reflection. In a way, they were as much victims of their bloodlines as any peasant born beneath them, bound by tradition, suffocated by duty, and doomed by the very purity they prized. When you look at a Habsburg portrait, the long faces, the pale eyes, the slightly vacant expressions, you can almost feel that weariness. Centuries of obligation painted into oil. A dynasty so afraid of contamination that it forgot how to survive. And yet, their castles still stand. Tourists wander their corridors, marveling at portraits of kings and queens who all look like cousins at a disappointing wedding. The ghosts of those bloodlines linger quietly, a genetic echo of Europe's grandest, strangest experiment in self-preservation. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, maybe think of Charles II, sitting on his throne, jaws sagging, praying for a miracle that never came, or of Queen Victoria, smiling proudly over a family tree that looked suspiciously like a circle, or of all those kings and queens who lived and died believing that keeping love in the family was noble, when in truth, it was simply inevitable, because history, like genetics, has a way of repeating itself, and sometimes it just needs a long nap. Let's drift again now, away from dynasties and toward something softer, sadder, and perhaps even stranger. Next time, we'll visit the quietest corners of medieval life, where children born to crowns and castles rarely lived long enough to wear them. Up next, sickly, spoiled, and sad medieval royal childhoods. For now, breathe slow and let the Habsburgs rest in their marble portraits, forever surrounded by family. Sickly, spoiled, and sad medieval royal childhoods. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived the genetic labyrinth of the Habsburgs. And if you drifted off somewhere between hemophilia and drooling monarchy, that's fine too. Tonight, we're staying in bed, but moving back in time, back to an era when being born royal didn't guarantee much, except perhaps an early funeral and a very uncomfortable hat. Because while history remembers the kings and queens who reigned, it tends to forget the dozens of their children who didn't. The pale, feverish little heirs, the ones who coughed themselves into sainthood before they ever learned to read their titles. This is their story, a quiet one. And, if we're being honest, rather damp. Let's begin in the 13th century, a period famous for castles, crusades, and extremely unsanitary medical advice. Childbirth, even for queens, was an exercise in hazard. In the best hospitals, the walls were covered in religious icons and soot, and if you were lucky, your midwife had washed her hands sometime last week. Noble women were expected to produce heirs quickly, ideally male, ideally not dead. The survival rate for royal infants was dismal. Up to half died before age 5, often from infections, fevers, or the vague medieval diagnosis known simply as teething, because, naturally, everything was blamed on teething. Convulsions? Teething. Rash? Teething. Sudden death? Very aggressive teething. In the royal nursery, medicine was a blend of prayer, leeches, and optimism. A sickly prince might be bled to balance his humors, or fed ground pearls dissolved in wine, because if you're dying, you may as well do it expensively. One chronicler described a baby being treated for melancholy humors by being wrapped in fox fur. It didn't help, of course, but it did make him the most fashionable corpse in Christendom. Now, you might imagine that royal children were raised in luxury, silk sheets, golden cradles, lullabies sung by angels, and, technically, yes, but emotionally, it was more like a cold boarding school with a better chandelier. Children of the nobility were handed over to wet nurses almost immediately after birth. The queen's role was largely symbolic. Her job was to deliver the child, not raise it. So a royal infant might grow up recognizing the nurse's voice, but not his mother's. When the child turned around 7, he or she was often sent to another household, not for education, exactly, but to absorb the proper manners for the class they were expected to rule. It was less parenting and more outsourcing your heir. One particularly sad case was Prince William, son of Henry I of England. He was Henry's only legitimate son, the golden boy of the Norman dynasty. Every hope, every alliance, every prayer hung on him. At 17, he drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, a drunken, overconfident voyage where nearly every passenger was noble, and nearly everyone died. When news reached Henry, chroniclers said he never smiled again, which, in royal terms, means roughly 25 years of very uncomfortable silence at dinner. The succession crisis that followed, known as the Anarchy, plunged England into civil war for 2 decades, all because a single royal teenager had boarded the wrong boat. It's a grim reminder that medieval dynasties were built on fragile bones, and even when they survived childhood, royal offspring were rarely well. Constant intermarriage meant hereditary illnesses were everywhere. Add to that the medieval diet, meat, wine, and anxiety, and you have a recipe for lifelong gout. Take Edward the Black Prince, for example, a brilliant soldier, adored by his troops, and dying slowly from dysentery before age 40, or Henry VI, who became king at 9 months old and spent much of his adult life in mental collapse. Historians still debate whether it was schizophrenia, severe depression, or just the natural side effect of being surrounded by courtiers who never said no. The French royal line wasn't doing much better. The Valois princes were notorious for fragile health and fragile tempers. Charles VI, for instance, known as Charles the Mad, he inherited the throne as a child, grew up adored, then abruptly began believing he was made of glass. He refused to let people touch him, had iron rods sewn into his clothes to prevent breaking, and occasionally ran screaming through the palace corridors, convinced assassins were hiding in the tapestries. Doctors prescribed the usual treatment: prayer, restraint, and ignoring the problem, which, to be fair, was standard therapy until at least the 19th century. Royal tutors didn't have it easy either. Imagine trying to educate a classroom of miniature monarchs, each convinced they were divinely superior to you, and all likely to develop tuberculosis before graduation. Lessons focused less on reading or mathematics, and more on genealogy, etiquette, and how to look pious while being bored. One 15th century manual for princes instructed: never scratch yourself in public, nor yawn before ambassadors. It does not mention literacy. Now, the phrase spoiled royal child conjures certain images: tantrums, jewels, maybe a small crown fitted for bedtime. And that's not entirely wrong. Charles II of France, known as the Bald, was said to have screamed so loudly as an infant that nurses stuffed herbs into their ears. Richard II of England threw silver plates at servants who displeased him, and Ivan the Terrible of Russia. Well, the nickname kind of speaks for itself, but behind the tantrums was often fear. Royal childhoods were political minefields. A sick child could mean a shifting alliance. A healthy one could become a hostage at any given moment. There were half a dozen royal children being traded across borders as marriage promises or insurance policies. Tiny, nervous chess pieces moved by very large, anxious kings. Even in peace, childhood was brief. A girl might be betrothed at 6, married by 12. A boy declared of age at 14, old enough to command armies, but still years away from growing a full beard. The result was predictable. Frightened teenagers making world-altering decisions. Take King Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII. He ascended the throne at 9 years old, spent his reign surrounded by scheming adults, and died of tuberculosis at 15. His final words reportedly were, "I am faint," which is a fitting epitaph for an entire generation of royal children. Let's drift over to Russia now, where royal infancy was even less restful. The Tsars of Muscovy saw every heir as both sacred and disposable. Nannies were chosen from noble families, and infants were swaddled so tightly they couldn't move their limbs for months. Mobility, apparently, was a democratic trait. When a child fell ill, priests were summoned before doctors. If that failed, which it usually did, they'd blame witchcraft or the evil eye and start executing servants until morale improved. Ivan the Terrible's childhood, for instance, was one long trauma montage. Orphaned young, neglected, half-starved, he spent his youth watching boyars, the noble class, poison and stab each other for control of his guardianship. By age 13, he'd learned the appropriate royal response to insecurity. Feed your enemies to the dogs, literally. So when Ivan grew into a paranoid, violent adult, history looked back and said, well, that tracks. Not all royal childhoods were miserable, though. Some were just weird. In the late 15th century, Maximilian I of Austria was raised by tutors who believed physical discomfort built character. He was regularly made to sleep on wooden boards and bathe in cold water to prepare him for the hardships of kingship. He later became obsessed with jousting, armor, and self-promotion, a man forged entirely from discipline and chronic neck pain. Meanwhile, Louis XIV, the Sun King, had a very different upbringing. He was pampered endlessly, surrounded by courtiers who treated him like a living idol. Every meal, every nap, every sneeze became a ceremony. Even his bowel movements were public events. Courtiers competed for the honor of handing him towels. So, while Maximilian was being toughened by frostbite, Louis XIV was learning that the world revolved around his digestion. Two different paths to monarchy, both ending in self-absorption. The irony, of course, is that royal parents loved their children. They just didn't have the luxury of showing it. Affection was considered politically dangerous. Too much favoritism could spark rumors, jealousy, or rebellion. So they expressed love through control, arranged marriages, strict etiquette, and constant supervision. The result was a generation of children who learned to smile beautifully while trusting no one. It's little wonder that so many monarchs later developed the particular brand of melancholy we call divine loneliness. By the Renaissance, things improved slightly: cleaner nurseries, fewer plagues, and slightly less fox fur medicine. But emotional neglect remained standard practice. Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent away from her mother at 5. Elizabeth I, her cousin, spent much of her childhood imprisoned or ignored, depending on the current political weather. When she became queen, she reportedly said, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England," which is poetic and also concerning. Royal children were raised to rule, not to relate, which meant they grew into adults capable of commanding armies, but incapable of basic intimacy. And yet, amid all the chill and ceremony, there were small moments of warmth. A letter from a young Henry VIII to his father calls him, "My most loving king." A note from Anne of Bohemia to her daughter simply reads, "Do not be afraid. The Lord loves small girls, tiny, flickering pieces of humanity beneath all the marble and gold." So, the next time you see a portrait of some solemn child in lace and jewels, try to imagine the real child behind the paint, the one who coughed through winters, recited prayers he didn't understand, and learned far too soon that every smile was a performance, because being born royal wasn't a blessing, it was an obligation, one that began in the cradle, and, for most, ended in a tomb no larger than that same cradle. Let's drift now from the nursery to the workshop, from the children of kings to the children of stone. Up next, the children who worked the cathedrals, a story of orphans, builders, and faith carved with blistered hands. For now, breathe slow and let the royal nursery fade into quiet. The children who worked the cathedrals. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, I'm impressed. You've made it through witch trials, royal deformities, and melancholy monarchs. That's quite a bedtime resume. Tonight, we're leaving the castles behind. We're going down to the cold ground, where stone dust clings to skin and the sound of hammers echoes like heartbeat and prayer. Because tonight, we're drifting into the slow miracle of medieval cathedrals and the small, unseen hands that built them. Cathedrals are strange things. They look eternal, as if they simply grew out of the earth, like mountains with better interior design. But of course, they were made, stone by stone, and they took centuries. That's the part we tend to forget. The cathedral you see today in Paris or Chartres or Cologne was begun by one generation and finished by the great-great-grandchildren of the people who started it. Entire lives were spent carving a single arch, and many of those lives belonged to children. Medieval building sites were busy, chaotic, and loud, a mix of masons, carpenters, quarrymen, and apprentices, plus the occasional monk supervising, and a handful of nobles pretending to understand architecture. Children were everywhere. Most began as apprentices around age 8 or 9. They hauled water, carried stone, and swept the scaffolding. Over time, they learned to chisel, to cut, to climb. It was dangerous work. Falls were common. Dust filled their lungs. And the pay, if they were paid at all, was mostly in food and the vague promise of salvation. But for an orphan or a poor boy from the countryside, a cathedral site was one of the few places where skill could become a future. A grim sort of social mobility, carved in limestone. One chronicler from 14th century France described the construction of Amiens Cathedral as a city within a city. There were workshops for glass, iron, wood, and cloth, food stalls, taverns, makeshift chapels, and tucked between them, dormitories for apprentices, many of them under 12. Some slept on straw. Some slept beneath the scaffolding itself, lulled to sleep by the steady rhythm of hammers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a kind of belonging. They were part of something larger than themselves, a building that, if it didn't collapse, might outlive them all. Of course, cathedrals were never just buildings. They were propaganda in stone. The church's way of saying, "We are big, and you are small." And yet, the irony is that those monumental symbols of divine power were built by the smallest, poorest hands in Europe. If you stood inside a cathedral as it was being built, you'd hear the hum of languages: French, Latin, Flemish, German, the medieval equivalent of a multinational workforce, and among them, the thin voices of children repeating prayers before lifting a beam twice their weight. Their masters were the master masons, half engineers, half magicians. They guarded their knowledge like treasure: geometry, proportions, secret ratios, all passed down through whispered teaching. Apprentices started with simple tasks: carving leaves, animals, and grotesques. Some of those little stone faces you see tucked into corners, grimacing, smiling, sticking their tongues out, were practice pieces carved by children. A few even snuck in their own likenesses, a kind of signature from the invisible class of builders. So, when you visit a cathedral and see a small, lopsided gargoyle with big eyes and a mischievous grin, you might be looking at a medieval teenager's idea of a practical joke, 500 years old and still smirking. Life on the site followed the rhythm of the church calendar. Work stopped on feast days. Mostly, though stopped sometimes meant continued quietly if the bishop wasn't looking. Meals were simple: bread, onions, thin ale. Children were given watered beer instead of water, not out of cruelty, but hygiene. Medieval rivers were less refreshing stream and more biological experiment. Apprentices learned to read a little, draw a little, pray a lot. They learned to respect geometry and gravity equally, one for the soul, one for survival. In England, the guild system kept things organized, sort of. Every trade had its own rules and hierarchies. Masons were especially proud. They considered themselves elite. Their craft was sacred, their tools symbolic. To be initiated as a full Mason was like joining a secret order. There were oaths, signs, and sometimes mildly alarming handshakes. That's where the later myths of Freemasonry come from. These medieval stoneworkers who guarded their craft like scripture. For the apprentices, those rituals were a distant dream. Most never advanced far enough to take them. They spent their lives cutting stone for someone else's glory. But still, when the sun hit the stained glass and the walls glowed red and gold, maybe they felt a small flicker of pride. Not all cathedral children were builders. Some were choir boys, the other half of the cathedral's living machinery. Choir boys had their own hierarchy, their own rivalries, and their own miseries. They were trained to sing in perfect Latin, whether they understood it or not. Voices had to be clear, angelic, and, above all, disciplined. The training was harsh. Wrong notes could mean canings or fasting. In winter, they sang with blue lips and stiff fingers, and when their voices finally broke, they were often dismissed, their usefulness spent. One 15th century bishop described choir boys as necessary instruments, like bells, which is a lovely sentiment if you happen to be a bell. The line between devotion and exploitation was thin. Children worked for the glory of God, they were told, but mostly they worked because they had no choice. The church, in its pragmatic way, believed that hard labor and music purifying the soul. It probably did, though it also conveniently purifying the cathedral budget. And yet, those same children built spaces of breathtaking beauty: the soaring vaults, the rose windows, the carved angels, all born from aching backs and calloused hands. If faith can be measured in effort, then theirs was immense. Some cathedrals recorded the names of their masons and masters, but most of the workers remained anonymous, their identities lost beneath the marble saints they carved. We only know them from hints, graffiti scratched into hidden corners, a name, A date, a crude little drawing of a horse or a sun in York Minster. Restorers once found a child's footprint pressed into the dried mortar behind a choir stall, barefoot, small, probably about 10 years old. A quiet signature left by someone who likely never imagined anyone would see it again. And yet, here we are, centuries later, talking about them, remembering a footprint in stone. It's easy to romanticize the Middle Ages, to imagine the cathedral builders as noble craftsmen, whistling while they worked, but the reality was slower, rougher, and much more human. There were strikes over wages, there were injuries and fires. Sometimes, whole sections of a cathedral collapsed after years of labor. When that happened, no one blamed the architects. They blamed sin. Clearly, someone hadn't prayed enough. It's the kind of logic that explains a lot about medieval Europe. Still, despite everything, despite hunger, accidents, and theology, they kept building for decades, for lifetimes. Why? Maybe because a cathedral was one of the few things in the Middle Ages that offered the illusion of permanence. A world filled with war, plague, and short lives needed something solid, something that said, "We were here." And the children who carried stones and sang hymns became part of that permanence. Their labor, their songs, their laughter, fossilized into architecture. Sometimes I wonder what they thought about up there on the scaffolding. Maybe they looked down at the towns below, the markets, the smoke, the tiny people, and felt, for a moment, like angels. Or maybe they just wished for lunch. Either way, they were part of something bigger, something that outlasted kings, plagues, and empires. Their work still stands, centuries later, and every beam of light through stained glass is, in its own way, a continuation of their effort. So, when you next walk into a cathedral and look up past the saints, the arches, the impossible height, try to imagine the invisible army beneath it, the children who mixed the mortar, the apprentices who carved a single leaf into a column, the nameless boy whose footprint still sleeps behind the choir. They built heaven, stone by stone, and then simply grew up and vanished. Let's drift onward, then, to another story about women in silence, and the ways power uses both. Next time, we'll be visiting the brides buried in ice, a quiet mystery frozen in Northern Europe's soil. For now, breathe slow and let the echo of hammers fade into stillness. The brides buried in ice. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still with me, you've drifted through witch trials, royal bloodlines, and the echoing halls of cathedrals. You've met the nameless, the unlucky, and the inconvenient. So, naturally, we're ending with something even quieter. Tonight, we're heading north, where the winters linger, and the dead don't quite disappear. We're wandering into the cold ground to visit the strange, frozen graves of women buried in wedding dresses. Now, this isn't a fairy tale, but it almost sounds like one. A few centuries ago, in parts of Scandinavia, the Baltics, and northern Russia, archaeologists began uncovering graves unlike any others. They weren't royal tombs or battle burials. They were simple, shallow pits, sometimes beneath old farmsteads, sometimes near forgotten churches. Inside were women, young, mostly, dressed not in rags or shrouds, but in fine white linen or silk. Some wore crowns of flowers. Some still had braids bound in ribbons that never decayed, and beside them, sometimes, rings, rosaries, and a few small objects. A comb, a coin, a clasp shaped like a heart. No men, no children, just women, buried alone, dressed for a wedding that never happened. The first discovery like this came in the late 19th century, when Swedish farmers digging through the frost unearthed a body near an abandoned village chapel. The woman's dress, remarkably preserved, shimmered faintly through the ice. Local papers called her the Snow Bride, a tragic nickname, of course, but fitting, because no one could explain her. Was she a bride who died before her wedding? A saintly virgin, buried in purity? Or something else entirely? For decades, the theories multiplied like snowflakes, each one delicate, slightly different, and ultimately a little bit wrong. Some historians argued these were votive burials, young women sacrificed symbolically to ensure a good harvest or favorable weather. Others thought they were plague victims, buried hastily but dressed well to appease God. A few leaned toward folklore, maidens promised to spirits or frozen lakes, laid to rest where ice met earth, as offerings to keep winter from devouring spring, which, I'll admit, sounds poetic, but doesn't hold up well under carbon dating. In truth, these women were likely a mixture of things. Some were indeed brides to be, dead too soon. Others were outcasts, unwed mothers, accused heretics, or women whose families couldn't afford church burials. And the wedding garments? Probably not literal bridal gowns, but rather symbolic shrouds, a final plea for purity in death if it couldn't be achieved in life. The white linen was a way of saying she died innocent, even if no one entirely believed it. It's a haunting compromise. Really, medieval Europe loved purity, but didn't make it easy to achieve. For women, virtue was less a quality and more a currency, and once spent, it was nearly impossible to earn back. So when a young woman's life went wrong, a scandal, an accusation, a pregnancy, or simply being in the wrong place when famine hit, her family might try to buy back a little honor through her burial. A fine dress, a floral wreath, a grave near the chapel wall, the illusion of grace wrapped around the reality of misfortune. Archaeologists have noted that many of these ice brides were buried with hands clasped tightly across their chests, a sign of deliberate care, almost reverence. Some were laid on fur blankets. Others had their feet bound loosely, perhaps to keep the body from curling as it froze. The preservation was extraordinary. Cold earth, minimal oxygen, and the slow patience of permafrost, all keeping their features eerily intact. A few even still had their eyelashes. It's strange what time decides to keep. In Finnish folklore, there's a story of the winter brides, maidens taken by the frost spirits before their weddings. They're said to appear in snowstorms, their veils made of drifting ice crystals, their laughter thin and distant. They ask travelers if they'll keep them company, and anyone foolish enough to say yes is found frozen by morning, smiling faintly. The tale probably began with these graves, people finding pale faces in the thaw, still wearing the remnants of beauty, in a world where most deaths were muddy and anonymous. A frozen bride was unsettling, too clean, too quiet, too composed. But there's another layer to this story, one that has less to do with folklore and more with the quiet politics of the church. You see, burial rites in medieval Europe were strictly controlled. Who got to rest in consecrated ground and who didn't said a lot about power. Women who died in childbirth without baptism, suicides, heretics, adulteresses, they were often denied church burials entirely, and so their families buried them anyway, close to the church, but not within it, in the frozen soil, just beyond the sacred boundary. They dressed them in white, placed rosaries in their hands, a gesture of defiance, or perhaps of apology. That's why so many of these graves are found in border spaces, near old chapels, but not under their shadow, by riverbanks, crossroads, or forest edges, places that felt halfway between worlds. It's as if the mourners wanted the church to notice, but not too much, to say quietly, she belonged with the blessed, but you wouldn't let her in. There's something profoundly human in that compromise, the persistence of love, even when faith refused to cooperate. One of the best preserved examples was found in northern Estonia in 1992. A young woman, about 20, buried beneath what had once been a wooden chapel. Her body was dressed in fine linen embroidered with silver thread, and her hair, astonishingly long, had been plaited into two thick braids. No jewelry, no sign of violence. At her feet, a small wooden box containing a few wildflower petals. Pollen analysis revealed they were from midsummer blooms. So she'd been buried in winter, but someone had kept those flowers for months, waiting for her, or remembering her. It's an image that doesn't need much embellishment. Grief, preserved in ice. And this wasn't unique to the north. Similar graves have been found in alpine villages of Austria and Switzerland, places where snow lingers half the year. Each discovery tells the same quiet story. A young woman, a fine dress, and a season that never changed. If you look at the clothing closely, you can sometimes see repairs, tiny stitches along seams and cuffs. Someone mended that dress, knowing she'd never wear it again. A strange tenderness, sewn right into the tragedy. Of course, historians can't resist trying to categorize everything. They've given these women various names over the years: virgin burials, frost maidens, ceremonial corpses, each one colder than the last. But I like to think of them as the lost brides, not because they were all brides, but because they represent a kind of interrupted belonging, a promise that never made it past the frost. Their graves are simple, their stories incomplete, but they stand as quiet records of how grief adapts, how even in centuries obsessed with sin and purity, people still found ways to mourn softly. Sometimes, archaeologists talk about cold preservation, as if the ice itself were a kind of mercy. It slows decay. It keeps faces intact. It refuses to let time finish its work. And maybe that's what these brides were meant to be. A pause button on loss. A way for families to hold on just a little longer. The ground froze. The flowers withered. But she remained, untouched, unchanged, as if still waiting for the bell to ring. There's something heartbreakingly gentle about that idea, that for all the cruelty and chaos of medieval life, people still went to the trouble of giving someone beauty at the end. They might not have had the words for trauma or redemption, but they understood gesture: a white dress, a braid, a wreath of summer flowers, symbols of what could have been, carefully laid into the earth and left to sleep beneath the snow. Centuries later, when archaeologists lift those coffins from the frost, the air that escapes is the same air those mourners breathed. It's like exhaling a memory that never melted. And for a moment, you can almost picture it. The candles, the whispered prayers, the sound of ice cracking underfoot as the grave was sealed. A brief flicker of warmth in the cold, then silence again. So if you ever find yourself walking through an old northern churchyard in winter and the snow muffles your steps, remember that you're probably not alone. Beneath the ground, in the quietest corners, there might be a few forgotten brides still keeping vigil, their white dresses long faded, their flowers turned to dust, but their stories intact in the frost. A strange, soft kind of immortality. What did executioners do when they weren't chopping off heads? Hey everyone, tonight, We're drifting back to a time when a good day at work might include sharpening your axe and your social isolation. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's talk about one of the strangest jobs in history, the life of the medieval executioner. Now, before you picture a grim man in a black hood swinging an axe in slow motion, take a deep breath. We're not here for horror. We're here for the quiet parts, the in between moments, when the heads weren't rolling, and life went on in all its awkward, oddly domestic detail. Because for most of the year, executioners weren't chopping off heads, they were doing laundry, tending gardens, brewing beer, or, rather less glamorously, cleaning up whatever part of town no one else wanted to touch. They were, in short, the medieval equivalent of that neighbor you greet politely but never invite over. Friendly enough, useful, slightly cursed. Let's start with the basics. Executioners weren't always chosen because they wanted the job. In fact, almost nobody wanted the job. In the Middle Ages, being an executioner was seen as polluted work, not evil. Exactly, just spiritually contagious. You were the person who handled blood, touched corpses, and dealt with impure substances, and according to medieval logic, that made you permanently unclean. So how did anyone end up doing it? Usually, by accident. Sometimes a condemned man would be offered a deal. Take the executioner's job or lose your own head. And, unsurprisingly, many decided that a lifetime of awkward dinner invitations was preferable to immediate death. Others inherited it. Executioner families were a thing, like blacksmiths or bakers, only with considerably more anxiety. A few even became dynasties. In Germany, the Franz Schmidt family held the office for generations, father to son, each one swinging the blade and taking meticulous notes, because of course they did. Franz Schmidt is a good place to linger for a moment. He was the executioner of Nuremberg in the late 1500s, educated, methodical, and unnervingly calm about his work. He kept a diary, which survives to this day. It lists every execution, every beating, and every punishment he performed, carefully written in neat Gothic script, as though he were recording gardening notes. Over his career, Schmidt executed 394 people. He also flogged or branded hundreds more. But here's the twist. When he wasn't doing that, he worked as a healer. Yes, the man who might decapitate you on Tuesday could also cure your gout by Friday. And apparently, he was good at it. People came from miles around for his herbal remedies, bone setting, and leech-based medical advice. He treated noblemen, priests, and even visiting dignitaries, though one imagines they avoided eye contact. It's a strange duality, isn't it? The man who takes life by law, also restoring it by hand. But in medieval Europe, that wasn't unusual. Executioners often doubled as healers because both jobs involved an intimate and unsettling understanding of anatomy. They knew how the body worked. They knew where to cut. And in a world before modern medicine, that made them useful. They also worked as butchers, knackers, or waste collectors. Again, not because they enjoyed it, but because no one else would. Handling death and decay was considered spiritually dangerous, so executioners became specialists in everything no one else wanted to touch. Dead animals, sewage, rotten food, you name it. One town record from 14th century Germany lists the duties of the local executioner as follows. Keep the gallows in repair. Remove dead dogs from the street. Clean the latrines by the river. And perform executions when required. A glamorous resume? Indeed. Socially, executioners existed in a gray zone. They were both necessary and despised. You couldn't have a functioning justice system without them, but you also couldn't invite them to your daughter's wedding. Most cities required executioners to live outside the walls, literally and symbolically. They were the human equivalent of a medieval warning sign. Here lies the edge of civilization. Beyond this point, unpleasantness. Their homes were often near gallows fields or riverbanks, places no one else wanted, and yet they were sometimes wealthy. Being feared didn't mean being poor. Executioners were paid well, especially in large cities. Some even wore fine clothes and carried swords, symbols of authority, not bloodlust, but social status. That was another story. People avoided them in the market. Priests refused to give them communion, and their children often had trouble marrying outside the executioner class. Yes, that was a thing. A small, awkward dating pool filled with people who all had the same strangely specific job. Despite the stigma, executioners often had families, wives, children, pets, all the quiet trappings of ordinary life, just lived in the shadow of the scaffold. Their homes, according to records, were surprisingly tidy. Many took pride in their craft. They believed that performing execution swiftly and cleanly was a kind of public service. After all, a botched beheading was not just messy, it was bad publicity. So, they trained, they practiced, and in some cases, they became almost respected. The ideal executioner was calm, precise, and merciful, a professional who could end a life in one stroke. That's how men like French Schmidt saw themselves. He even wrote in his diary, "I pray God that my hand does no wrong," which, considering his line of work, is about as responsible a mission statement as one could hope for. Now, between executions, they had a surprising amount of free time. Contrary to popular imagination, people weren't being executed every week in a medium-sized town. There might be only a few capital cases a year. So, the rest of the time, executioners were basically freelance laborers with very specific skills. Some trained apprentices. Others served as guards or torturers for interrogations. Some collected taxes, perhaps on the theory that if you could swing an axe, you could certainly handle a coin purse. In some towns, executioners even acted as unofficial police. Who better to enforce curfews than the man everyone already feared? Still, the psychological side of the job was strange. Executioners lived among the condemned. They spoke to them, ate with them, and sometimes prayed with them. In smaller towns, they often built rapport with prisoners because someone had to. They were part priest, part undertaker, part bureaucrat, responsible for making death tidy and socially acceptable. French Schmidt again offers a glimpse of that inner world. He often recorded final words, describing the condemned as penitent, fearful, or at peace. He wasn't cruel. He saw himself as a servant of justice, not its author, a man caught between duty and damnation. There's something quietly tragic about that. A man so close to death every day, yet so desperate to live rightly. Executioners weren't always men either. In a few rare cases, women stepped into the role. Records from early modern Germany mention a widow named Maria Paler, who took over her husband's duties after his death. She performed several hangings, handled tortures, and was paid exactly the same rate as her late spouse. Progressive, in a bleak kind of way. It's worth remembering that, by the standards of the time, the executioner's job was still an office, a legal, administrative position. You could inherit it, resign it, or even lease it. One French executioner in the 17th century reportedly rented out his services to neighboring towns. traveling with his equipment like a particularly grim traveling salesman. Speaking of equipment, executioners were known for keeping meticulous care of their tools: axes, swords, ropes, branding irons, each one cleaned, oiled, and sometimes even named. Franz Schmidt's sword still survives in a museum in Nuremberg. It's long, elegant, and engraved with the Latin phrase, "Lord, guide my hand," which is touching and also slightly chilling. Executioner's swords weren't like battlefield weapons. They had no point, just a wide, curved blade designed for precision. They were tools, not trophies, and oddly, they were often beautifully made, because nothing says civilized justice quite like a well-polished instrument of death. There's a persistent myth that executioners always wore black hoods. They didn't. That image comes from theater and later art, a convenient way to turn an uncomfortable public servant into a faceless symbol of authority. In reality, executioners dressed like everyone else, sometimes even a little better, because appearance mattered. You were representing the state. After all, if anything, the hood would have been impractical. Hard to swing a sword cleanly when you can't see your target. Most executioners simply tied back their hair, rolled up their sleeves, and got on with it. Efficient, unceremonious, and deeply unphotogenic. By the 18th century, the role of executioner began to soften. Public executions were less frequent. Punishments leaned more toward imprisonment and exile, and slowly, the office became less hereditary and more bureaucratic. But the stigma lingered. Even when the job was just pulling a lever or dropping a blade, the social isolation remained. Old families still whispered, churches still hesitated, and the children of executioners still found doors quietly closed to them. It's remarkable, really, how long society can remember what it prefers to forget. So, what did executioners do when they weren't killing people? Mostly they lived, awkwardly, quietly, and sometimes with surprising grace. They brewed beer, they played cards, they mended fences, both literal and social. They attended fairs, stood at the edge of dances, and perhaps, every so often, laughed at a joke they weren't supposed to hear. They were the necessary shadows of medieval life, half healer, half outcast, caught in that peculiar limbo between fear and dependence. And yet, in their strange way, they remind us that even the most unsettling professions were still human ones. Someone had to do it, and someone had to live with it. Let's drift gently onward, because the night is long, and history is full of other uncomfortable professions. Next, we'll wander into the world of royal physicians, the men who treated kings and queens, often with results that were, let's say, educational. For now, rest easy, and remember that behind every legend of blood and justice was just another man, hoping the axe was sharp enough to get it right on the first swing. Good night.